Hello. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We are starting this evening's program. Shall we please be on our feet while the speaker and the chair take the high table? I humbly ask that we put our mobile phones on silent. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone. The President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, the past Presidents of the Academy, Vice Presidents, Fellows of the Academy, Honorable Ministers, Members of Parliament, Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. We are here this evening in respect of the memorial lecture, the Ephraim Memorial Lecture, and I'm privileged to give you a brief background of Ephraim and also to introduce the chairperson for this important occasion. Ephraim was born on the 13th September 1899 at Peki, Abetile, in the Peki traditional area in the Volta region. And as a male child born on a Wednesday, he was called Kweku. His father was Stephen Amuya, a wood carver, who was popularly called Papa Stefano. His mother was Sarah Akoram Ama. Ephraim was baptized by Reverend Rudolph Mallet on the 22nd of October, 1899. Amu first went to school in May 1906, and at about age 12, he entered Blengo EP Boarding Middle School, where he showed much interest in and love for music and agriculture. Amu passed the Standard 7 School Leaving Certificate examination and also passed the Abetifi Teachers Seminary examination. In 1916, he and two other colleagues had to walk 150 miles from Peki to Abetifi with their boxes on their heads to start teacher training education. Dr. Ephraim Amu, later Tata Amu, attained national stature very early in life as a creative artist and an intellectual. He combined the role of musician with that of an educator, social critic, and cultural activist. Tata Amu was concerned not only with theory and practice of music and related arts, but also with larger issues of tradition and innovation, as well as change and progress, and the role of patriotism in nation building and the moral code of a civil society. He always had something inspiring and thought-provoking to say in his songs and reflections. Just a brief background on the genesis of this important memorial lecture. Dr. Ephraim Amu and the memorial lecture was instituted in the Academy through the initiative of Emeritus Professor J.H. Kwabena Nketia in 1999. The maiden lecture was delivered the same year by Emeritus Professor J.H. Kwabena Nketia on the topic, Synoptic Portrait of Amu. Subsequently, the Amu Memorial Lecture Series has been delivered by eminent scholars, most of whom are themselves fellows of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. Ladies and gentlemen, permit me to introduce our chair for this important occasion. Our chair is Professor Joseph R.A. Ayi, who is currently the Vice President for the Arts section of the Academy. He was elected a Fellow of the Academy in 2005 and served as Assistant Honorary Secretary for the Arts section between 2014 and 2016, as well as Honorary Treasurer between 2016 and 2017. He is the action plan between 2015 and 2019, and the National Decentralization Policy and Strategy between 2020 and 2024. He has over 200 publications in several areas of political science, public policy, and administration. His current research interests include higher education governance and management, policy and institutional response to COVID-19, and political institutions and public sector management in Ghana's Fourth Republic. Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the chair for this occasion, Professor Ayi.
Thank you, Assistant Honorary Secretary, President of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences, Vice Presidents, past President and Vice Presidents, the Ephraim family, the Emmanuel Choir, students, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. For me, this lecture this afternoon is a tripod, or you call it Trinity if you want to go the Christian way. Tripod or Trinity because there are three things. The first one is this lecture is being held today, Kwame Nkrumah Memorial Day. The second one is Ephraim. And the third one is the title of the lecture, Ethics of Nation Building. And nation building stands in the middle whilst Amu and Nkrumah are at the other side. These are people who actually espouse the values of nationhood and nation building. So it's not by accident, it's not sheer coincidence. God has his own way of doing things. So I think that the lecture is appropriate for the day. And we have a very interesting topic at the same time, the ethics of nation building, perspectives from the LEGON tradition of philosophy. So if in case you want to extend the tripod, you may have to get a quadruplet. So the University of Ghana is also at the other end. And so we have somebody who is well versed in the topic, and his name is Professor Martin Ode Eji. He is an associate professor of philosophy in the Department of Philosophy and Classics at the University of Ghana. He obtained a D.Litt. A.Phil. in philosophy from the University of South Africa, an M.Phil from the University of Ghana, and a B.A. Honours from the University of Stockholm, Sweden. His research interests include African philosophy, applied ethics, political philosophy, and philosophies of liberation. He is the author of more than 30 peer-reviewed journal articles and book chapters, and of 2 books, The Paranormal, An Inquiry into Arcane Metaphysics, and Epistemology and Africa's Development, The Imperatives on Indigenous Knowledge and Values. He is also the editor of an anthology of philosophical commentary on Kwame Nkrumah's philosophy, Disentangling Conscientism, essays on Kwame Nkrumah's philosophy. He has held several fellowships, the latest of which was fellow of the German Reference Center for Ethics in the Life Sciences, University of Bonn. He is currently working on his 3rd book, Empathetic Humanism, a LEGON tradition of African philosophy. Professor J is a fellow of the Ghana Academy of Arts and Sciences. Before I invite him to the podium, we invite the Emmanuel Choir to give us a spot of music.
Thank you all very much for coming. And at the cost of some repetition, let me express my gratitude to the Academy for nominating me to deliver this lecture in memory of Dr. Amu, one of the greatest patriots of our dear country, And on a day that's been set aside to celebrate the birthday of yet another great patriot of our country, Dr. Kwame Nkrumah. It is an honor indeed, and I'm very grateful to the Academy for that nomination. I also would like to express my gratitude to the older fellows, my seniors in the Academy. The President is here. You just heard from the Vice President for the Arts section. The Vice President for the Science section is here. Our most venerable Nana SKB Asante is here. And my colleague and good friend, Rosa Kofi Ejekum, is also here. My former Vice Chancellor here, all of whom are also fellows of this academy. Thanks a lot for coming to listen to me. The family of Dr. Ephraim work ethic. I hope that you would find my talk here useful and a vindication of sort for the work that we're doing in the department. Thank you. And so many students here. I hope that sooner than later we will see many of you join us in the department to think and write about the LEGON tradition of philosophy. Finally, let me mention my family members, my friends who are here, my adopted brother, Dr. Otinga Chiampong, my daughter Sasa, I don't know where you are now, son Doji, and my lovely wife, my best friend, and my foremost intellectual companion. Thank you very much for coming to support me speak here. I will begin by pointing out that the topic of my lecture is not the ethics of nation-building perspectives from the LEGON tradition of philosophy, but rather it is the perspectives of. And the difference between those two propositions is philosophically relevant. It's the perspectives of the LEGON tradition because my emphasis is on possession. My emphasis is on the ownership of those perspectives, but not necessarily the source of the perspectives which the preposition from signifies, because it is possible for thought to come from somewhere that does not originate from there. It is possible for sources to be just transient sources, but what I intend to express, to argue here, is that these perspectives actually originated from the philosophy department in the University of Ghana. So we're talking about the perspectives of, but not from. In a nutshell, I intend to defend the thesis that professional Ghanaian philosophers who have worked in the philosophy department of the University of Ghana have successfully produced a body of thought and a systematic approach to philosophy that merits the status of a tradition of philosophy. And that this tradition of philosophy offers very germane perspectives, germane moral philosophical perspectives for the task of nation building. I argue that these perspectives differ in kind from the liberal philosophical values that underpin our 1992 Constitution, and finally, I would suggest ways in which the perspectives of the LEGON tradition can be harnessed for nation building. But let me begin by clarifying the central terms in the title of my lecture. What do I mean by ethics? What do I mean by nation building? And what do I mean by tradition? Well, by ethics, I mean simply moral philosophy, or the critical reflection on moral norms and conduct. Now, concerning the notion of nation building, I would like to suggest that the usage of the term nation state to refer to Ghana is a usage that cannot be taken for granted. I suggest this because Ghana is a state. It's a political and legal entity with a centralized government that maintains a monopoly over the legitimate use of force over a heterogeneous ethnic conglomerate within a certain geographical territory. That is Ghana. The groups, and this is what independence conferred on us. It's a statehood, but not necessarily nationhood. The groups that are a conglomerate in this territory that is Ghana often share a common language, basic values, the norms that form the basis of their common interpretation of experience and strengthen their consciousness and identity as a group. And these are the features of nationhood. These are the virtues of nationhood. Nationhood, then, is just a state of affairs in which the citizens of a political unit transfer their allegiances from their primary ethnocultural affiliations to the state and live and act in unison in pursuit of common and defined ideals. So the well-formed consciousness of group identity, I wonder whether it's something that we have in Ghana, and as such, whether we can refer to Ghana as a nation. But I'll speak more about this later. I think, therefore, that my teacher, Professor Kwame Gyekye, was right in defining nation building, I quote, as a purposive attempt to bring different peoples together to think and to act and to live as if they were one people belonging to a larger ethnocultural group. If this is the task of nation building, then I would want to suggest that nation building signifies both a political and moral need. A political need involves the effort to rally citizens to share the goals which government and public policy seeks to achieve. And in Ghana, the most abstract expression of the moral ideals of nationhood is freedom and justice. I mean, Article 35 of our Constitution specifies this by saying that Ghana shall be dedicated to the realization of freedom and justice. But now, the achievement of the ideals of a free and just society are contingent on yet more moral virtues, the virtue of honesty, the virtue of accountability, and the virtue of fidelity to the public interest. And for these reasons, I want to suggest that in the task of nation building, politics ought to be guided ultimately by ethics, by moral, philosophical principles and conduct. And as we shall see shortly, the members of the LEGON tradition of philosophy believe that such anchoring of the political and administrative processes of nation building on moral principles is not only possible, but also desirable. Now, what do I mean by a tradition, or a tradition of philosophy? By this, I mean two things. First, that there are discernible patterns that configure a distinct way of producing and disseminating knowledge on human experience. And that these patterns have within them inbuilt mechanisms for transmitting and also challenging those thoughts from a generation to another. So essentially, a tradition of philosophy a tradition of philosophy for me includes patterns of thought production and dissemination and inbuilt mechanisms for intergenerational assessment of previous thought within the tradition. So my definition, I think it's best to dispel right at the onset some suspicion that the idea of a tradition, a philosophical tradition, implies that members of that tradition must share identical concerns and conclusions. No, they do not. Members of a tradition may differ on the details of the questions that they tackle and in their conclusions, even on similar questions. However, the underlying principles that animate their reflections would invariably converge into a common pattern of convictions and assumptions that distinguish their distinct knowledge-productive efforts from others. And what distinguishes the distinguishing feature of the LEGON tradition of philosophy that I'm going to espouse today are two. One, ties of mutual conceptual influence and resemblances in methodological approaches, and also interest in some thematic philosophical themes. But before I turn to the distinguishing features of the tradition, let me briefly introduce those that I consider to be the initiators of this tradition. And they are Kwesi Wiredu, who was born in 1931 and died last year, and William Emmanuel Abraham, born in 1934, he is still with us, and Kwame Gyekye, who was born in 1939 and left us in 2019. So as you can see, of these three, it's only Professor Abraham who is with us physically. And Abraham is the only African to date who has been admitted to fellowship at All Souls College in Oxford by examination. To date, the only African. He passed that exam in 1969 or 68, and since then, no African has ever been admitted to fellowship of All Souls College by examination. In fact, that fellowship examination used to be described as the most difficult philosophy exam in the world. He is Professor Emeritus at the University of California at Santa Cruz. He studied philosophy at LEGON and at Oxford between 1957 and 1960, and eventually became the Pro-Vice Chancellor of our university. His main publication is called The Mind of Africa, published in 1962. In the 2015 preface to the second edition of the book, Abraham gives two main aims for writing the book. He says, the aim of writing the Mind of Africa is, quote, to show how common themes in existing African cultures could provide a good foundation for successful policy in the newly liberated African countries. And the second aim was to demonstrate to Africans that they have good reason for confidence in their own cultural roots and to reject the habits of thought which are unsuited to the dignity and the needs of independent peoples. That's W. Abraham. What about Kwesi Wiredu? Well, Wiredu was recently awarded the Order of the Volta by our president. He also completed a BA at the University of Ghana, went on to Oxford to do a BPhil, which he completed in 1958, returned to Ghana in 1961 to our department to teach. And he was there until 1984, when he joined the University of South Florida as professor. He remained there until his death as emeritus professor in 1922. His most influential monographs are Philosophy and an African Culture, published in 1980, and a book called Cultural Universals and Particulars, published in 1996, which is the Bible that at least I use as an African philosopher. He also he edited a companion to African philosophy and co-edited the book with Professor Gyekye called Person and Community in 1992. The third initiator, Professor Gyekye, also obtained a BA at the University of Ghana in history, in fact, and went on to study philosophy, and a PhD in philosophy from Harvard in 1969. The same year, he was appointed lecturer and rose to the rank of professor at the university in 1984. He authored 7 books. You don't want to know the titles. But what you would want to know is that all the 3 philosophers and the distinction of fellowship of this academy. Abraham was elected Fedo in 1960, Yuredu in 75, and Jeche in 1989. You may wonder why I select only these three philosophers, distinguish them as the founders of the LEGON tradition of philosophy. I mean, Ghana has indeed been blessed with illustrious philosophers who have also have a distinctive influence on Ghanaian public life. So why exclude Dr. J.B. Dankwa, for instance, the founder of the first political party in Ghana, who obtained a PhD in philosophy in 1928 and wrote the Akan Doctrine of God, which is one of the most influential works in Ghanaian metaphysics and moral philosophy. And why do I leave out Kwame Nkrumah, our first president, prime minister and president, who authored Conscientism in 1964, and in my estimation, a book which is amongst the most seminal works in ethics and the philosophy of liberation ever to emerge in Africa. Why do I leave out Nkrumah? Why do I leave out Kwame Anthony Appiah, who, a very prolific philosopher, authored 13 books on philosophy and awarded the National Humanities Medal by President Obama in 2012. These three philosophers, Dankwa, Nkrumah, and Appiah, also espouse systematic philosophy. So why exclude them from the origin of the LEGON tradition? I can explain that. In my view, Dankwa and Nkrumah are better considered precursors to the tradition, but not central parts of it. Why do I say that? They are both, in very important senses, very important founding thinkers of the tradition. But I still think that they differ from the three philosophers that I have identified as the originators of the tradition. One way in which Nkrumah stands apart from Abraham and Jeche and Yuredu is that although Nkrumah sets out very important philosophical positions and he engages Marxists and materialists and idealists, nevertheless, I think his intellectual legacy in the main is in Pan-African ideology and political strategies of liberation. Dr. Dankwa's main publication, The Akan Doctrine of God, engages in very sophisticated metaphysical and normative thinking. But it hardly engages with any Ghanaian philosophers, even though at the time of its publication in 1968, Nkrumah's Conscientism had been published and Abraham's Mind of Africa had also been published. Also, perhaps, and I stand to be corrected by my elders here, I think that Dankwa's main intellectual contribution to the intellectual history of this country should be in politics, particularly his promotion of political liberalism in Ghana. So, even though I admit that both Dankwa and Nkrumah had philosophical training and did write philosophical works, nevertheless, I think they remain principally politicians and exponents of political strategies. And so I just want to consider them as thinkers who laid the foundation for the more systematic academic philosophy that Abraham and Yuredu and Jetche engaged in. So that is, for me, the main focus of the delineation of the tradition of philosophy is academic philosophy. Now, if this is the case, then why leave out Kwame Appiah? If the litmus test is academic philosophy, then why is Appiah not included? Appiah is a Ghanaian, or I believe he would consider himself to be. He was a LEGONite, he was a TA in LEGON, very prolific philosopher, whose early works, at least his first work, In My Father's House, is rooted in Ghanaian experience. So why exclude him? Well, I will still exclude him. And one reason why I would want to exclude Appiah is his orchestrated interest in what I would describe as African diaspora-linked thought, which deliberates on questions of ethnicity, race, identity, multiculturalism, cosmopolitanism, and a particular brand of pluralism. And I think that these thematic interests places him more firmly in the academic tradition of W.E. Du Bois and recently of Louis Gates and of Cornel West, for instance. So these are thematic interests that differ from those that engaged the attention of the LEGON tradition, the LEGON philosophers. Now, one may say that these reasons that I have offered for excluding both Nkrumah and Appiah and Dankwa are arbitrary, or one may even say they are frugal, parsimonious. They are parsimonious means to resolving a difficult problem. Yeah, it's a difficult problem, yeah? But a solution has to be found to it. And the solution that I have adopted is basically to rely on a very well-known philosophical problem-solving principle, which is called the Occam's razor. Occam's razor recommends adopting explanations that are constructed with the smallest possible set of elements. I think it's appropriate to adopt Occam's razor to excise and place the tradition in a much more focused setting. I would now want to talk about the distinguishing features of the tradition. But before I do that, let's have some music.
Tutu, bubu, say, jiri, jiri,
What are the distinguishing features of the LEGON tradition of philosophy? 2. I've alluded to them earlier. 1, I said, is their methodological approach, their approach to the work of philosophizing. And the other is the interests, the themes that they engaged in. Let me begin with a discussion of their methodology, which I call reflexive positionality. Reflexive positionality completely rejects the central tenets of the analytic philosophy of tradition in which all these 3 philosophers were trained. They were trained as analytic philosophers. They come here and they say, thank you. You've great knowledge you've imparted to us. But you see, some of the things that you will say, we can't work with it. So although they don't call the method that, clearly, I want to call the approach that their works took reflexive positionality. It is widely agreed that analytic philosophers, and I should be careful here because some of my colleagues here know better than I do, and please correct me later. Not here. But I think it is widely agreed amongst we philosophers that analytic philosophy places great emphasis on the logical analysis of terms, propositions, and sentences in seeking solutions to philosophical problems, you see. So for them, the clarity of concepts that convey problems, clarity can be gained without reference to the historical or cultural setting from where the concept or the problem comes. In other words, that objective and logical analysis, ascertaining the logical relations that pertain between and amongst terms, can itself yield meaning. That's one of the core tenets of analytic philosophical methodology, I think. So for this reason, analytic philosophy has been criticized, in fact, as being ahistorical. It's been slapped with the tag of ahistoricism for disdaining historically engaged conceptual analysis. Now, our philosophers, reflexive positionality, vehemently opposes this logical, analytical streak of their training. So a dominant assumption of the members of this tradition is that philosophy needs history and contextualization, that philosophy is nothing but rational thinking that is aimed at explaining the world and the experience of human beings in it, and that experiences occur within space and time. Philosophy is therefore, by nature, critical thinking about fundamental questions from a place. Therefore, the philosophy of the African philosopher, or the philosopher who comes from Africa, must derive its creative energy from the African place. It must derive its creative energy by engaging questions that are meaningful to the African experience, and by offering a modern articulation of patterns of thought that are embedded in the historical, the intellectual history of our cultures. The upshot of reflexive positionality as a methodology, then, is that meaning must be inscribed into context. Meaning must be inscribed into concepts with great sensitivity to the intellectual and the social contexts in which those concepts occur and in which those concepts are meant to be applied. And perhaps the most succinct statement of this method is Wiredu's advocacy of conceptual decolonization. What does Wiredu say about conceptual decolonization? He says, for a philosophy to be conceptually decolonized, for a philosopher to enact conceptual decolonization, you must do two things. One, you must avoid or reverse, through your own critical self-awareness, the unexamined assimilation of foreign conceptual elements in your thinking. Through self-examination, try to either avoid or to revise them. And then secondly, you must endeavor to exploit the resources of the indigenous conceptual schemes from where you come in your philosophical work. This is necessary. It is necessary to adopt these two approaches, he says, because even though philosophical concepts are the most fundamental categories of human thought, yet modes of philosophical thought do reflect peculiarities of culture and the environment. Therefore, philosophical thinking is bound to have conceptual disparities among different philosophical traditions. There can be no universal concept of freedom. There can't be a concept of democracy that can be universally applied anywhere, because concepts come with cultural baggages, you see. So the English word justice comes with a cultural baggage. Thinking about justice in English, largely, is thinking in English about justice, right? About the history of the struggle in the English-speaking Western world, the struggle through which the notion of justice evolved. All those, in some sense, are encoded in the idea of justice. So when you lift it and places it here and say that your logical analysis between concepts would yield useful meaning, you must be a bit careful. It is for this reason that, say, an Ewe philosopher who takes reflexive positionality seriously must position herself reflexively by paying heed to the conceptual schemes in the our language in analyzing the idea, say, of justice. So that is the method that they evolved and worked with. What about the themes? Oh man, the LEGON philosophers worked from logic to virtually all the areas of philosophical thinking. I have been told that since it's a holiday, we can use 5 hours here, but I want to be modest and limit my talk to 2 hours at the most, or an hour and a half, as quickly as I can. And why do I say so? I say so that because I will limit myself to just 2 themes that they discussed that I think are very seminal for the notion of nation building. And then after that, I'll talk more specifically about how this thinking can be applied in nation building. One of the themes that they all converged on, let us call it moderate communitarian personhood. Personhood. But they analyzed personhood from 2 philosophical perspectives. They talked about the person, the ontology, that is, the theory of the being of the person, and from here, they evolved a moral philosophy of personhood. I'll talk just briefly about these, and then I'll also talk about their ideas on democracy. When you are confronted with the idea of personhood philosophically, some of the questions that come to the fore are, what is the nature of a person? What's the nature of a human being? How does this nature bear on moral thinking? How does this nature bear on a person's conduct, among others? And a very strong consensus exists among our 3 philosophers that a person is by nature a relational being. Relational meaning what? Well, relational because a person, they think, by nature participates in a network of social relations, and as such is inseparable from the ties of community membership. By nature, right? So community membership is so integral to the existence, to the being of an individual, that we can say that the life of such a person derives meaning from the existence of others within the social setting that he comes from. This makes the person a communal being by nature. The Bantu languages in South Africa have found a very nice word to encase this heterogeneous amounts of thought that goes into this. They call it Ubuntu, right? So we have a version of Ubuntu here, very well worked out in the Department of Philosophy and Classics at the University of Ghana. This, the relationality of the person, is the ontological aspect of their theory. Like I said, from this ontology, a moral account of personhood also emerges. And Kwame Gyekye calls this moderate communitarian personhood, a moderate communitarian moral theory. There are 2 aspects of the moderate communitarian moral theory. One of them, the first two, is a fork. One of them is that even though a person is by nature communal, person is by nature dependent on this network of social relations in the expression of her humanity, in spite of this, the moral worth of individuality, the moral worth of that individual's autonomy is not dissolved by these communal networks. In other words, that even within community relations, we cannot negate the moral worth of individualism. The moral worth of the individual cannot be discarded by community, because what the community considers as the common good comprises, amongst others, I quote him, the social conditions that will enable each individual to function satisfactorily in human society. So the first aspect of the moral theory of moderate communitarianism is an affirmation of the moral value of individualism. The other moral highlight of moderate communitarianism, or of relational ontology, is that to be human is to be different, but not to be indifferent in the social setting. The idea of the interdependence as an essential mode of being human, and the reciprocal responsibility that this elicits from everyone, means that you may be different. You may think and act and behave differently, but you cannot be indifferent to others in the setting in which you are. Solidarity is an important element of your being. Fellow feeling ought to be an important element of your being. Professor Kwesi Uredu, I think, captures this very succinctly in a phrase, and the phrase is that onipa na ohia. It's a chief phrase, onipa no ohia, as I'm not doing, but he himself, so I don't want to stray in a direction. The interpretation is not mine, it's Uredu's, you see. So if you disagree, I know where his children are. I can show you to them. But he offers two complementary interpretations, which I think he says that the idea that onipa no ehia bears two complementary meanings. One is that human fellowship is the most important element of human needs. Human beings have needs, but human fellowship is the most important of them. And secondly, that the welfare of human beings, human welfare, is the basis of all moral value. Now, I think this is perhaps the most beautiful statement of humanism, but that is another matter. Because you see, a lot of thinking going around in this country now is that, our mores, our conduct moral thinking should be based in religious thought. No, the LEGON philosophers say human needs, human welfare is the basis of all human endeavor, which I think is a very high expression of humanistic thought. Now, this is what they think. Please permit me at this point to digress briefly to compare this communitarian conception of man with the liberal conception of man, which I'm convinced our 1992 Constitution is premised on. I will explain why I think so. Such a comparison is very important, you see, because the idea of a person as a citizen is vitally important for the task of nation building. Vitally important, too, is the Constitution, the supreme law of our land, which is expected to guide and regulate the efforts of nation building. As such, one may question whether our Constitution should be based on principles and values that do not derive principally from the intellectual traditions of our society, a society whose institutions and persons that Constitution is meant to guide. The liberal conception of man is different substantively from the communitarian conception of mind. The liberal conception of mind is different for several reasons. One, liberal philosophy expresses a presumption in favor of the moral preeminence of the individual over community by conceiving of the human being as a discrete entity by nature. By nature, the human being is discrete, and he exerts her personal powers to fulfill her own self-interest. This is a core belief of liberal political philosophy. Now, such a point of view pervades liberal philosophy from the 17th century to today. I mean, most of you would know about the Leviathan, Hobbes's Leviathan, which originates liberal political and legal philosophy. Hobbes tells us that moral ideas do not exist in man's nature. Man, in nature, by nature, do not have the capacity for moral ideas. Human life, by natural necessity, I quote, is a war of every man against every man, in which nothing can be unjust, unquote. Hence, morality, the notions of right and wrong, of justice and injustice, have no place in the nature of man. This same thought continues, the trajectory of this thinking continues in Locke. In his two treatises of government, he tells us that man is free. He's a rational individual who rules his life by his own consent and by a natural law that is derived from his own individual conscience, unquote. So let me reiterate again in parentheses that this primacy accorded to the human individual over community by liberal, legal, and political thought is different in kind, by which I mean radically different, inconcilably different. Well, yeah, maybe there can be some gnawing on the borders, right? But at core, they are different from the perspectives of the LEGON tradition of philosophers. And this perspective says that the human person by nature is a composite of individuality and sociality, and that the human person is born with a morally encoded nature. However, what this means is that even prior to becoming an individual, even before you are born, the person is enmeshed in the web of relationships. It is not a case that, there are individuals, wholly constituted and intrinsic individuals who engage with each other in pursuit of the common good, the idea of the social contract. No, the individual is already enmeshed in the web of relations at the point of his birth. So, in the LEGON framework, community both generates and contributes to, fosters a person's individuality. And morality is something that individuals are expected to know by nature, that it's a path of thinking and conduct that makes them what they are as human beings. Still on the digression, Professor Kwashiga, in his inaugural lecture to this academy last year, vigorously advanced the view that the 92 Constitution has no doctrinal leanings, in contradistinction to what I'm saying. And also that the Constitution aligns fully with the constitutional history of Ghana. He cited Justice Sowa, I think it was, to argue that the values of the people are their experiences over the years, and that there have been stages of our constitutional development, and from 1969, the liberal elements of the 1969 Constitution, which are survived in the 92 Constitution therefore can be considered to be derived from our constitutional history. Well, whereas I admit that, post-independence history, the 9 years of the rule of the CPP may have justified the advent of liberal constitutionalism, I still maintain room to question whether these liberal values should constitute the theoretical foundations of our Constitution today. I'm not persuaded that they should. Yet, I insist that they constitute the theoretical foundations of our Constitution. Now, there is enough justification for this insistence in the Constitution itself and in the pronouncements of eminent Ghanaian constitutional lawyers, Nana S.K.B. Asante here included. I'll tell you about that later. Before I go on to tell you about why the Constitution is liberal, let me talk about the second theme that I think the LEGON tradition engaged. And this is the theme of democracy, particularly consensual democracy and the legitimation of political power. You would remember, and in those of you who are in the humanities, in 1989, an American called Francis Fukuyama, he published an essay in the National Enquirer. First, it was an essay called The End of History. And then he expanded it into a book in 1992 that he called The End of History and the Last Man. In both of these works, Fukuyama proclaimed the triumph of liberal democracy, and with it, the end of the evolution of political culture universally in the world. According to this view, because of the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the end of the Cold War, the triumph of liberal democracy, all this shows that liberal democracy is the final form of government for all nations, yeah? And that this final form of government represents the end of history. That is, the end of the quest, the means for political representation. It's funny because let me note in parentheses that this same end of history theory, and it's a paradox, of course, was espoused by Marx. You remember Karl Marx's prediction of the end of history in the sense of historical rules generating universal laws, generating a revolution that will install proletariats at the helm of political structures in all countries. It's the same thing that Fukuyama was saying. But Fukuyama was saying, rather than the proletariats, it's liberal democracy. It's a remarkable claim. But since then, the global tendency to regard multi-party elections as necessary conditions for successful democratic culture gathered momentum, you know? It gathered momentum until Myanmar, and recently in our backyard, Mali and Burkina Faso and the rest of it. But the ethical trust, the moral trust of what Fukuyama was saying are twofold. First, he is saying that universalizing liberal democracy is morally defensible. Morally defensible because liberal democracy supplies the conditions for satisfying the political ends of people everywhere. And secondly, that the most important vehicle for this practice is political partyism. These are the two central moral claims there. Liberal democracy as electoral democracy is democracy per se, all right? This tendency in Africa is exemplified by the fact that at least 44 of our 55 countries are electoral democracies. Again, this was before Mali and those people there, the Niger and all of that, yeah. But I think, you know, we're about 80%. We must wonder whether we haven't fallen into Fukuyama's trap. This tendency has been endorsed by Article 50 and Article 55 of our Constitution. I'll speak about that shortly. The LEGON philosophers reject this. They claim that liberal democracy is not universally viable. Abraham says that political theory, insofar as it deals with institutions, is relative, and it's by no means, we can't assume that it is universally applicable. Uredu rejects this claim by elaborating a political theory that he calls consensual democracy. Consensual democracy refers to a political system that sustains political pluralism and representative government without the need for political parties. So it's not a call for a one-party state, and it's not a call for military rule. It's important to make that clear. I am told the chair has brought me something here which I don't want to look at. So, although I'd wanted to